My name is Talia, and I'm 27 years old. I work at the local library in a small town that most people have likely never even heard of. My life is simple, maybe a bit too plain for others, but it's my own. I've always been the quiet, introverted type, much happier to lose myself in a book than engage with the bustling world outside. The library is my safe haven. It's an old, cozy building with creaky wooden floors and shelves that have definitely seen better days. But to me, it's perfect. Every morning, like clockwork, I open the library doors at 9 a.m., flip on the lights, and breathe in the familiar scent of aging paper and ink. It's a routine I never tire of. My parents passed away when I was still a child, and I was raised by my grandmother. She was the one who instilled in me a love for reading, always encouraging me to explore and learn. But she's gone now too, and I'm alone. No siblings, no close family left, just me in my small, quiet world. Good morning, Talia. Mr. Jenkins, a regular visitor, greets me warmly as he strolls into the library. He's an elderly gentleman who spends his days poring over history books. Good morning, Mr. Jenkins, I reply with a smile. A new batch of history books came in yesterday. I've set some aside for you. You know me too well, dear. He chuckles as he shuffles toward his favorite shelf. The day continues like that, quiet and familiar. People come and go, and I recognize almost every face. I help a group of kids find books for their school project, recommend a romance novel to Mrs. Harrison, and guide Mr. Thompson to the science fiction section. It's a peaceful life, and I find comfort in its predictability. But then one day, everything changed. Cassius walked into the library, and my whole world shifted. He came in looking for a book, but he didn't seem like the typical library goer. Dressed sharply in a crisp suit, he stood out with his confident walk and air of self-assurance. "Can you help me find a book?" he asked, his voice smooth and compelling. "Of course. What are you looking for?" I responded, trying to stay composed. "It's a novel. The Great Gatsby, I believe." "This way," I said, leading him to the classic section. When I handed him the book, our hands brushed for a brief moment. It was a simple, fleeting touch, but it left a strange feeling lingering inside me. "Thank you, Talia," he said, glancing at my name tag. "I'm Cassius." "It's nice to meet you, Cassius," I replied. That brief encounter was the start of everything, the beginning of what I believed to be a love that would last forever. The start of a journey that pulled me from my quiet, predictable life into a whirlwind of chaos and betrayal. If only I had known then what I know now, maybe things would have turned out differently. But life doesn't give you warnings, and sometimes you only learn lessons the hard way. After that first meeting, Cassius began visiting the library more often. It was strange because he didn't seem like someone who'd spend much time reading. Yet, each time he came in, he'd ask for a book recommendation, and we'd chat for a few minutes. One day, he arrived just as I was struggling with a box of new books. "Need a hand with that?" he offered, walking over to help. "That would be great. Thank you," I said, relieved. As we placed the books on the shelves, he asked, "So, Talia, what made you want to work at a library?" I shrugged, smiling softly. "I've always loved books. They're like friends to me. Plus, it's nice and quiet here." He laughed. "I can tell. It's like a different world in here." Over time, our conversations grew longer. I learned that Cassius worked for his family's business, something to do with real estate. He was easy to talk to, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like someone was truly interested in me. Then one day, he surprised me. "Talia, would you like to have dinner with me tonight?" he asked, his eyes hopeful. "A date?" I asked, caught off guard. "Yes, a date," he said with a warm smile. I hesitated for a moment. This was uncharted territory for me, but something about him made me want to say yes. "Okay, sure. I'd like that," I replied, my voice wavering slightly. That evening, we went to a small restaurant in town. It wasn't fancy, but it was cozy, and we spent hours talking about everything and nothing. For a while, I forgot about the loneliness that usually filled my life. On the walk home, Cassius turned to me and said, "I had a really great time tonight, Talia. You're different from anyone I've ever met. I didn't know how to respond, so I simply smiled. He continued, I'd love to see you again. Would that be okay? I nodded. Yes, I'd like that. After that night, we started seeing each other regularly. He'd take me out to dinner, or we'd go on long walks. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was part of something more, part of a world that extended beyond my quiet life in the library. Before long, I found myself falling for him. Hard. He was charming, attentive, and made me feel special. When he proposed, I didn't hesitate. I said yes without a second thought. Looking back now, I wish I had paid attention to the signs. I wish I had noticed that the charm was only a facade, hiding something far darker underneath. But love can blind you, and I was deeply in love. Or at least I thought I was. After we got engaged, things began to shift. It started with his parents. From the very beginning, they didn't approve of me. They saw me as beneath their son, someone who didn't come for money. The first time I met them, it was painfully clear they didn't like me. We had dinner at their house, a grand, luxurious place, nothing like what I was used to. Talia, this is my mother, Brielle, and my father, Damon. Cassius introduced them. Nice to meet you, I said, trying to smile. Brielle looked me over, unimpressed. So, you're the librarian? She asked, her tone sharp. Yes, that's right, I answered, feeling smaller by the second. Damon chimed in. Cassius, couldn't you have found someone more suitable? I wanted to crawl into a hole. The dinner dragged on, painfully awkward, and it became all too clear that they didn't think I was good enough for their son. Cassius stood up for me when his parents made their harsh comments, and that only made me love him more. But before our wedding, they insisted on a prenuptial agreement. They claimed it was just a formality. Since I didn't have much to my name, I agreed, without any objections. After the wedding, I moved into Cassius's house, which was actually his parents' house. They had gifted it to him, but they acted like it still belonged to them. They would show up all the time, unannounced, as if they had every right to. Brielle, Cassius's mother, would waltz in and immediately start giving orders. Talia, make us some coffee, she'd demand the moment she stepped inside. Without saying a word, I would do as she asked, trying to avoid conflict. One day, as I was serving coffee, Brielle pointed at the TV and said, Remember, Talia, if you and Cassius ever get divorced, this isn't yours. It wasn't just the TV, they constantly reminded me that nothing in that house belonged to me. Over time, Cassius started changing too. He wasn't the man I fell in love with anymore. He began joining in on the cruel jokes his parents made about me. One evening, while I was deciding what to wear to a family event, I asked Cassius for his opinion. This one makes you look less drab, he said with a smirk. It hurt deeply. It felt like he became a different person around his parents. He stopped defending me and instead laughed along with their insults. Living in that house was unbearable. I felt like an outsider, an unwelcome guest in my own home. I kept hoping things would improve, but they only got worse. The stress was starting to take a toll on me. I began experiencing severe stomach pains, but I tried to brush them off. Then one day, while working at the library, I collapsed. When I woke up in the hospital, the doctor explained that my collapse was caused by stress. I stayed in the hospital for several days, and during that time, Cassius didn't visit. He didn't even call. I had never felt so alone. Then, out of nowhere, a notary visited me in the hospital with surprising news. My great-aunt, someone I barely remembered, had passed away and left me her fortune, $60 million. I was in complete shock. I had no idea what to do with that kind of money, but it instantly changed how people saw me. I wasn't just the poor librarian anymore. As soon as Cassius and his parents found out about the inheritance, their attitude shifted. They suddenly became overly sweet and caring. Darling, we're so happy for you, Brielle cooed, pretending to be concerned about me. Yes, we're family, and we should support each other, Damon added with an exaggerated smile. But I didn't trust their sudden kindness. It was too much, too fast. After they left my hospital room, I overheard them talking outside. They didn't realize I could hear them. She's such a fool. Can you believe our luck? Cassius laughed. Brielle chimed in. We need to make sure she doesn't leave you, Cassius. Maybe you should have a child with her. That'll keep her tied to you. Hearing those words made me sick to my stomach. They didn't care about me at all. They only wanted my money. At that moment, I knew I had to escape. I had to get away from these people and take back control of my life. I wasn't going to be their pawn any longer. When I was discharged from the hospital, I had a plan in mind. I returned home, where Cassius and his parents were waiting, acting like the loving, concerned family they had never truly been. "Oh, Talia, we were so worried about you," Brielle exclaimed, trying to sound sincere. I nodded and played along, not wanting to tip them off that I knew their real intentions. Cassius approached me, asking, "So, when do you get the inheritance?" His eagerness was obvious. I looked at him, this man I once thought I loved, and realized he was a stranger to me now. "Soon," I replied calmly, "but it's nothing you need to worry about." His smile faltered and he pressed, "But we're married, Talia. What's yours is mine, right?" I forced a smile. "Of course, darling." That night, I couldn't sleep. Their words echoed in my head, their greed, their fake concern. It made me feel sick. I got out of bed and began writing. I wrote down everything they had done, everything they had said. It was like years of pent-up frustration finally poured out of me. The next morning, I met with a lawyer. I explained everything and showed him the prenuptial agreement. He was shocked but reassured me, saying the agreement would protect me. "You're doing the right thing," he told me. When I got back to the house, I found Cassius and his parents sitting in the living room. As I walked in, Damon smiled at me with cold eyes. "There she is, our brave girl," he said. I sat down, clutching my purse tightly. "I have something to say," I told them. They all turned toward me, curious. "I'm filing for divorce," I said, my voice steady. The room fell silent. Brielle's face twisted in anger. "What? You ungrateful little," she started, but Cassius jumped to his feet. "Talia, you can't be serious." "We love you," he pleaded. "Do you, Cassius?" "Because I don't feel loved. I feel used," I responded firmly. Brielle was livid. "We'll sue you. We'll take half of your inheritance," she spat. I reached into my purse and pulled out a copy of the prenuptial agreement. "Actually, you can't. This says neither of us can claim the other's property in case of divorce." For the first time, they were speechless. I stood up. "I'm leaving, and I don't want any of you to contact me." I walked out of that house, their shouts and insults following me. It was the hardest thing I had ever done, but as I drove away, I felt an enormous weight lift from my shoulders. I was free from their manipulation, their cruelty. For the first time in a long time, I could breathe. I rented a small apartment in the city. It wasn't anything luxurious, but it was mine. After years of living under someone else's control, I finally felt a sense of peace. I was still dealing with the divorce, but I felt capable of handling it. Then one day, I got a call from the lawyer. "Talia, there's something you should know about your great-aunt's will," he said. "What about it?" I asked, puzzled. "There's a condition. You need to use part of your inheritance for a charitable cause." It was your great-aunt's final wish. I was surprised. I had no idea my great-aunt had been so philanthropic. The lawyer continued, "She wanted to pass that responsibility on to you." I hung up the phone, deep in thought. It felt like a sign, a push in a new direction. I started researching charities and causes, determined to do something meaningful with the money. That's when I came across a small organization that helped women who were victims of domestic abuse. It struck a chord with me. I contacted them and arranged a meeting. The woman I met, Zinnia, was passionate and dedicated. "We provide shelter, legal aid, and counseling to women who have nowhere else to go," Zinnia explained. As I listened to her, I felt deeply moved by the stories she shared. "I want to help," I said, feeling a spark of purpose I hadn't felt in years. With Zinnia's guidance, I used a portion of my inheritance to fund a new shelter for women. It was an incredible feeling, knowing I was helping others find their way out of situations like I had. A few weeks later, Zinnia invited me to the opening of the shelter. It was a small, intimate event, but the atmosphere was filled with hope and gratitude. As people mingled, I noticed a familiar face in the crowd. It was Lorelei, an old colleague from the library. "Talia, is that you?" she asked, clearly surprised.
Lorelei.
"It's been so long," I said, pulling her in for a hug. "What are you doing here?" she asked curiously. I shared with her everything about the shelter and my involvement in helping create it. Her eyes widened in disbelief. "That's incredible, Talia. I had no idea," she said, impressed. "It's a new chapter for me," I replied, smiling. We spent the rest of the evening catching up, and it felt wonderful to reconnect with an old friend. As the event wound down, Zinnia approached me. "Talia, I can't thank you enough. This shelter is going to change lives," she said warmly. I looked around at the faces of the women who now had a safe place to call home. "It's the least I could do," I said, feeling a warmth in my heart I hadn't felt in a long time. As the days passed, I became more immersed in the work at the shelter. Each day was rewarding and brought with it a sense of fulfillment I had never known before. My new life was shaping up, and I felt like I was finally in control of my destiny. Then, one day, out of the blue, my phone rang. The number on the screen was one I hadn't seen in a while, Cassius. My heart raced with mixed emotions, but curiosity won over. Hello, Cassius," I said, keeping my voice calm. "Talia, I need to talk to you."
Can we meet?
"It's urgent," he said, sounding desperate. Reluctantly, I agreed to meet him at a public coffee shop. I hoped that being in a familiar, neutral place would help me stay strong. When I arrived, Cassius looked different. He seemed defeated, almost pitiful, as he sat across from me. "Talia, I made a huge mistake. I want you back. I realize now how much you mean to me," he blurted out, his eyes pleading. I stared at him, feeling nothing but contempt. "Why now, Cassius?" I asked, my voice cold. He sighed deeply. "My parents, they controlled everything. They're the reason our marriage failed. I was weak, but I've changed." Anger surged through me. "You're blaming your parents? You stood by while they treated me like dirt. You laughed with them, Cassius." He reached for my hand, but I pulled away. "Please, Talia. I know I was wrong. I've changed." I stared at him, seeing the man I once loved, but now felt absolutely nothing for. "Changed or not, it's too late. I feel nothing for you, Cassius. Nothing but contempt." His face fell, and for a brief moment, I saw a glimpse of the Cassius I had married, but it was fleeting. "I'm sorry, Cassius. I've moved on. I have a new life now, a purpose, and there's no room for you in it." He nodded slowly, defeat written all over his face. "I understand. I just had to try." As I left the coffee shop, I felt a tremendous weight lift off my shoulders. It was over, truly over. The next day, there was a special event at the shelter. A local artist had donated a sculpture, and it was to be unveiled in the garden. As I stood among the people who supported and believed in me, I felt a sense of belonging that I hadn't felt in years. Lorelei stood beside me, smiling. "Talia, you've done something amazing here." The artist pulled the cover off the sculpture, revealing a figure of a woman reaching up toward the sky. It symbolized hope, strength, and new beginnings. Applause filled the air, and for a moment, everything in the world felt right. Zinnia came over to me, beaming. "Talia, this is just the beginning. There's so much more we can do," she said, filled with excitement. I looked around at the faces of the women who had found safety and hope in the shelter. Zinnia was right. This was just the beginning of something far bigger than I ever imagined. Life continued to be busy and fulfilling. Every day at the shelter brought new challenges and rewards, but I was thriving. My confidence grew, and for the first time in years, I felt fully in control of my life. I even started taking self-defense classes, something I never would have considered before. Then one day, as I was leaving the shelter, I noticed a car parked outside. My heart sank as I recognized who stepped out. It was Brielle, my former mother-in-law. She approached me, her voice softer than I had ever heard it. "Talia, we need to talk," she said, almost pleading. "I have nothing to say to you, Brielle," I replied, my voice steady. "Please, just hear me out," she begged. I stopped and looked at her, unsure if she was sincere. "What do you want, Brielle?" I asked, keeping my distance. "I want to apologize. I treated you terribly, and because of it, I've lost my son. I don't want to lose you too. You are like the daughter I never had," she said, her eyes glistening with tears. For a brief moment, I felt a pang of sympathy, but I quickly pushed it aside. "Brielle, you made my life a living hell. An apology won't change that. I've moved on, and I suggest you do the same." She reached out to me, but I stepped back. "Please, Talia. I know I can't undo the past, but I want to make things right." I shook my head. "It's too late for that. Goodbye, Brielle." As I walked away, I felt her gaze on my back, but I didn't look back. I had learned to stand up for myself, and there was no turning back to the way things were. The next day, I received a letter from Cassius's lawyer. He was contesting the divorce settlement, but I wasn't surprised. I was ready for this. I met with my lawyer, Marin, a sharp, confident woman. "He's got no leg to stand on, Talia. The prenuptial agreement is clear. He's just trying to intimidate you," she assured me. I nodded, resolute. "I'm not afraid of him anymore. Let's fight this." The court date finally arrived, and I walked in with my head held high. Cassius was there with his lawyer, and for a brief moment, our eyes met. There was a flicker of the old Cassius, but it disappeared just as quickly. The judge listened to both sides and ruled in my favor. The prenuptial agreement stood, and Cassius's claims were dismissed. Relief and triumph surged through me. After the session, Cassius approached me. "Talia, I'm sorry. I was wrong," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I looked at him, seeing the man I had once loved but no longer recognized. "Goodbye, Cassius. Take care of yourself," I said, walking away for good. As I left the courtroom, I felt a true sense of closure. That chapter of my life was finally over, and a new one had just begun.